This is a quick lesson on triadic arpeggios for classical guitar. I'm using examples from my new technique book. There's a link for that under the video, but feel free to pick up the tips for free. So most instruments will practice triadic arpeggios, which are just taking the building blocks of a chord, a triad, right? Which is the 1, the 3, and the 5 from a scale. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 3, 5, which is a basic chord, right? Once we stretch it into 2 octaves, though, it becomes very difficult on the guitar. But it's used in repertoire a lot, and most other instruments will practice this from the very beginning. Pianists, in particular, are able to practice their triadic arpeggios very easily. The reason I'm calling them triadic arpeggios is that guitarists often talk about arpeggios, but we're sometimes just talking about right-hand patterns over chords. We're not actually talking about a kind of a triad broken up, which you would in other instruments. So it's a very important thing to practice, but it's certainly more on the intermediate to advanced level once you put it into 2 octaves. If you would like easier examples, just make sure to grab my second method book, which has some smaller 1-octave arpeggios, which are easier to accomplish. So the main thing about this is that once you put it into 2 octaves, you'll usually have a challenging shift involved on the guitar. So you'll have to shift up the neck. Not always, but sometimes. And of course, it's right-hand fingering as well as left-hand fingering. The right-hand fingering can be tricky because you're usually going across the strings. So what I'll do is I'll just cover a couple of the patterns. I'll do one easy one and then look at some more challenging ones just to kind of explain some of the difficulties. But then you can go through all of them in the book on your own. So we'll start with C major, 2 octaves. So if we break that up into octaves, we'll go like this. C, E, G, and then another C, E, G, C, G, E, C, G, E, C. So essentially, on the guitar, it's a first position chord, open string, the G and the C. We're following the exact scale degrees, right? 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 5, 3, 1, 5, 3, 1. I prefer to play them with kind of an awkward string crossing with MA on the top. So I'm going P, I, M, A, M, A, M. But it's very common in repertoire to just double the thumb up. So we'll go like thumb, thumb, I, M, A, I, M, I, M, A, M, I, thumb. To do that double thumb sweep at the beginning. It's a very useful technique. In many repertoire situations, such as Villa-Lobos' Etude No. 2, you'll see the first kind of notes often slurred, which does facilitate the triadic arpeggio much more easily. But for technique purposes right now, we're not using slurs at all. But that's always an option for you when you're looking at this. So much of the first ones function just the same as that C major. Let's jump to a very different one. We'll jump to D major. Now, because there's no open string in the D major, except for the first note maybe, it's a little bit trickier because the shift would become very cumbersome, very difficult. So we're going to do a closed version this time. So we're going to take a triad here. So I'll break that up. 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 5, 3, 1, 5, 3, 1. Any right-hand fingering would work. What I've written in the book is P, I, M, A, M, A, M, A, M, A, M, I, P. But as long as you're alternating fingers, I think any fingering will work. I usually like to break it up into groups, like, so P, I, M, A, and then just alternate M and A for a little while, and then return at the bottom to M, A, M, I, P. So try to make a very easy arpeggio, a little bit of awkwardness, back to easy. Occasionally, the triadic arpeggio will link up very nicely with a chord shape you know, such as the B minor. If you know this B minor chord, then all you have to do is throw in the third there. 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 1, 5, 3, 1. Lots of different fingering options. If you're going faster, you have to constantly alternate, so P, I, M, A, M, A, M, A, M, I, M, I, P. Other times it just doesn't work out very nicely, such as the D minor arpeggio that I'll do now. In this particular case, we're going to have a shift, and it's just not going to be particularly easy because there's no way to actually do it in a comfortable way on the guitar. I've decided to just block it into somewhat familiar shapes. So for example, here's the first two notes, next three, top notes, back down to this familiar D minor shape here, top two notes, D minor. That's essentially what I've tried to group it into. It can be very confusing. So it can be very confusing thinking about the individual notes that way, but if you're thinking D minor chord, upper notes, back to D minor chord shape, then you have familiar shapes that you can kind of see within the triadic arpeggio. So triadic arpeggios offer just as much of a right-hand challenge as they do a left-hand challenge, and it combines many of the things that we've talked about so far within the technique book. So I would definitely put this on like the later levels as far as studying, and if you see my practice routines at the beginning of the book, you'll see that they don't really occur until the intermediate level. But that said, you could just start with the C major one and become proficient at that. It's pretty easy because again, it's just a C chord going to the top notes, and it has an open string shift, which makes it much easier. And most of the time in repertoire, a lot of the keys that are chosen have open strings, so you can do triadic arpeggios with an open string shift, making it much more easy to facilitate.